Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the third lecture in the Royal Armouries 2024 Summer Lecture Series. I'm Mark Bennis, I'm the museum's research manager. Thank you very much for joining us today. The Royal Armouries is the UK's national collection of arms and armour, spread across 3 sites. A historic home at the Tower of London, the main museum at Leeds, from where today's talk comes, and Fort Nelson outside Portsmouth, where we display the bulk of our artillery collection. We are now in the midst of our summer programme with combat displays, live interpretation and craft activities at Leeds, including jousting over the August bank holiday weekend, and D-Day commemorations and a children's assault course at the fort, if that's what interests you. We have more of these lectures coming up, which you can attend either online or in the museum at Leeds, or you can watch them again after the event on our YouTube channel. We've got 2 more instalments of the latest research from doctoral students, and then in October we'll start our winter lecture programme. So on some technical matters, after the talk, we'll be taking questions from the audience, both here in the museum and online. If you have a question, put it in the YouTube chat, or there's a Zoom Q&A function. If you're submitting them online, feel free to send them in as soon as they occur to you. I will put them to the audience, to the speaker after the talk. Yes, and we also have a feedback option now. Link in the slides, there's a QR code, and we've got something practical for the people in the museum. Please do let us know what you think of the talks. If there's anything we can improve on, we'll be more than happy to do so. So with the technical factors out of the way, let me introduce today's topic. Before the museum was a museum, it was a fortress, a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London. It was first besieged in 1191, but capitulated after only 3 days. However, far more exciting and informative siege warfare was taking place at the same time in the Middle East, as Latin and Islamic commanders fought over control of the strategic region. And to explain this period of warfare too, as we have today, Thomas Brossett of Lancaster University. So without any further ado, over to you, Thomas.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction and for organising the talk today. Thanks to the Royal Armouries for that, and to you, Mark. Also, thank you for everyone that joined us either online or in person today. It's really nice to see a few people here. So today I'm going to talk to you about siege warfare in the 12th century, looking especially at both the Crusaders' way of laying sieges, but also the Islamic way to lay sieges. Because most studies of medieval warfare tends to focus on battles, that are the big events usually, but they're quite rare as well. Raids, skirmishes, and sieges were by far more frequent. And so I thought it would be an interesting way to illustrate what happened in the period than to take what I've been basing my research on for the last 4 years as a PhD student. Also, so I wasn't sure exactly what kind of knowledge would people have on siege warfare. I went from the basic image of siege that we have in pop culture, which can be either in movies or in video games or in historical novels. And coming from that, trying to show you whether it's accurate or not, and showing you what the average siege kind of looked like, what the techniques were in the period. Is it? No. If you just want to. Yeah. So I've taken 2 screenshots of 2 different movies about siege warfare. The first one being in Kingdom of Heaven by Ridley Scott, and it's the Siege of Jerusalem in 1187, which is one of the siege I've been studying, and the other being a more fictional siege in the Lord of the Rings, the Siege of Minas Tirith. And as you can see, there are quite similar patterns in both scenes. You have very large armies. You have a huge number of siege towers that you can see, obviously, there all along, but also here and in the back. And you can also see siege artillery in Kingdom of Heaven, some trebuchets at the back, but also some catapults in Lord of the Rings are a bit less visible. You can also see a battering ram here, and that's kind of the usual depiction you have in movies. Very large armies fighting with a huge number of siege engines and assaulting the walls. However, I'll show you that as assault happened, sometimes with big armies, that quite a lot of these scenes that needs to be addressed because they're not realistic, or if they're only taking the exceptional events and not what the usual siege was. But before we go into the periods, I'm just going to introduce you to the sort of political background in the time I'm studying. So I'm starting my study in the First Crusade that arrived in 1097 in that region in the Levant and besieged Antioch, which is a city located around here. They besieged it for several months, and they moved on to capture Jerusalem in 1099. They were able to create 4 different states in the 12th century: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. All of these were lasting a certain time. The first one to disappear was the County of Edessa, that gradually disappeared from 1144 onwards and completely disappeared by 1150. And then the other states were gradually retaken by the gradual unification of Islam against them, especially by Saladin, which achieved to unify medieval Egypt, Syria, and Jazeera in 1183. So by the end of the period I'm looking at, and then in 1187 was able to defeat the Frankish armies in the Battle of Hattin. Following that, he was able to capture a huge section of their territories, reducing them to very little spot of territories. That was then stabilized by the Third Crusade, which restarted the Lionheart, in that negotiated a treaty, 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa, that secured a bit of land to this place. So basically what you can see as the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem is the start of what had been secured by that treaty, with some remaining of the County of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch. That's also when the Kingdom of Cyprus went to the Franks. It was before that Byzantine control. That's just for a very broad context. Obviously, we could do hours on the Crusade itself, but it was more to show you about the place I'm working on and what was the struggle. So basically, a fight with 4 different Latin states that had been created by Europeans, but that was having a huge population of local Christians and local Muslims facing different principalities, different Muslim principalities that were fighting against each other. I think one of the main thing would be not to just think about the Crusades as a war between Muslims and Christians. There were also wars between Muslims, and there were alliances between Muslims and Franks against other Muslims in the period. To go back on sieges now, so my work has been to identify as many sieges as possible from 1097 to 1192. And I've been working on Syria, which is in the medieval time, the region that encompasses a larger area than nowadays, and the Jazeera, which would be Upper Mesopotamia nowadays. So I've looked at a lot of different narratives, and I find out 730 different sieges led in that period, in that area. And that was done in 251 different locations. On the map, you can see about 220 of them. It's harder to locate the remaining 30 with enough precision to put it on the map. But you can see that the war spread a lot along the coastline and the start of the hinterlands, but very few places in terms of density were besieged the more you go east. So going from that quite huge data sets, I was able to establish some trends of siege warfare to see what the average siege was. But the first step was probably to define what a siege was at the time. There are many definitions that exist. I'm just getting through mine. There's a pretty open definition of sieges. You have more restricted ones. So I've considered every military operation against a settlement to be a siege if one of the 3 following criteria was to be found: either a direct attack against those settlements, either its fortifications or its suburbs, a blockade that could have been complete, that could also have been partial, with no minimal duration in time. So a single day of blockade would have worked in that regard. Or two other solutions, which are a bit more tricky. Either if a diplomatic solution was fine after at least a day of siege happened, or if the besiegers left after at least a day encamped in front of the places. Obviously, you have more restrictive definitions, you would have a bit less sieges, or you have more open definitions as well, which would give a bit more. It's just mine, and I'm happy to answer questions about this as well. So the main question, the first one was who leads the most sieges? And we have that impression usually that the Franks led a lot, because we've heard about the Crusades and how it was an invasion from the Franks. But what we can see from the data set is that about 3/4 of all sieges were actually prosecuted by Muslim commanded armies. The picture is a bit different when we look at who was attacked. It's a bit more balanced, in which it was nearly a 50-50 situation, when Muslim besieged were having 53% of sieges against them, the Franks about 43%, and the remaining being either Armenian-held strongholds, Greek-held strongholds, or sites that are not really held by any of the four, but in sources that are depicted as either thieves or bandits. It's a bit difficult to know who these people were, but you see a picture that is more balanced when you look at who was attacked. Then, if we moved at the kind of success, where siege is successful or not, we can see that about 62% of all sieges led to the capture of the place by the besiegers. So it's a pretty successful methodology and technique of war, for about 40% failure. What I count as a failure would not automatically be a failure for the campaign, because it might have been signing a peace treaty, might have been receiving a tribute, which might have been the objective of the campaign, but it's very difficult to estimate what the objectives were with the sources we have. And often you wonder whether the objectives written in sources are actually made up afterwards or not. So it was easier to look at, is the site changing ownership or not? So it's a success if the site was taken, it's a failure if the siege wasn't. So if we start to define the average siege, it's a siege led by Muslim besiegers against either Franks or Muslims, and being rather successful. Another question that I asked myself was whether sieges were long or short. And that's probably one of the main misconceptions that you can find in pop culture, in which sieges are portrayed as very long operations that would last for months, sometimes years, in which you'd either have the siege ending by an assault, or by the besiegers waiting for the besieged to surrender by lack of food. And I've looked at it in a statistical way, and I find out that sieges were very short indeed, because nearly 50% of all the sieges I was able to determine duration lasted up to 10 days. And if we look at, in fact, the first two categories, so sieges that lasted between a day and 45 days, nearly 80% of all lasted less than 45 days. And it's quite interesting, these 45 days, because in medieval Europe, a medieval knight could be expected to owe a military service up to 45 days. So that means that most sieges were in fact lasting normal duration of a military campaign of the time. And it's probably one of the very interesting finding of looking at so many sieges, that you can see that kind of pattern that you would not see otherwise. And most sieges that are studied are in fact in the longest, can you just, in the longest, so about 5% of sieges were actually long lasted over 6 months. And obviously, I mentioned the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade that lasted about 8 months. But also during the Third Crusade, the very famous siege of Arques from 1189 to 1191 by noticeably Richard the Lionheart for the end of the siege was amongst these exceptions. So when I was looking at sieges, I tended to look more at the shortest one that are more representative than at the very long ones. That tends to be more exceptional. And that duration tells us a lot about the question of whether the besiegers would wait for the besieged to run out of supplies. And the answer was absolutely no, because when I looked at the percentage of food shortage mentioned in historical sources, it's 5% of all sieges that experienced one, which is 39 sieges of 730. And an interesting thing is that a food shortage was not always decisive. In about half of all these 39 cases, the besieged were able to solve their issues. It was a temporary shortage that was solved. So when we look at that depiction of sieges being either assaulted or being taken by the surrender of the garrison because they lacked food, that doesn't add up with historical data. So in fact, surrenders happened about the same amount of time that assaults, but not because of food shortage issue. It was usually because a relief army was not coming to their help, so they decided to surrender, or because they estimated their troops were not sufficient to pursue the fighting, because as much as food shortages were rare for the besieged, they were more problematic for the besiegers that had to move an army, bring their own supplies, and if the food production around the settlement had been cautiously destroyed by the besieged, they would not be able to supply the army for more than usually 24 to 30 days. So sieges were fast because of that, because of the logistic issues of medieval armies. And also, it was about a sort of balance between cost and benefits. It was pointless to attack a site for months if it wasn't going to bring you enough in return. So medieval commanders were ready to abandon a siege just because it seemed that it would resist a few months. So economically speaking, it wouldn't worth the investment of money and potentially the losses of lives in front of the site. Instead, they would just go to the next settlement and see if this one was less well prepared. So let's look at the preparation. So first, I'm going to talk to you about the preparation of supplies by the besieged, and then we're going to look about more the technique, the siege engines that could be used. Thank you. So I find out by looking at these sources that there was a sort of standard operating procedure to supply a settlement. The first step was usually to gather supplies as soon as the location was taken or as soon as it was built. You were putting a sort of basic stock inside the settlement that would help you to resist if you were attacked immediately. And you can see examples of that happening in the north, in Apamea, in 1150, in Harim a year before, in 1149, but also in Banyas in 1164. That's only a few examples. Obviously, there are much more that are doing that, but I've just looked at that for the moment. Then you had that basic stock, but it would need to be rebuilt regularly to be improved by local production. So either the production of the farmers around the sites that were depending on the castle, or by buying food to further markets that were a bit further away, or by merchants that were coming to your place in your markets. And one other technique was with sites of very important strategical importance, like Ascalon, that was held by the Fatimid in Egypt, and that was resisting to the Crusaders for 50 years after their arrival. In fact, the Crusaders tried to surround Ascalon with different fortifications to block the supplying of these sites. So they couldn't really use the agricultural production around it because it was frequently raided. So instead, they were receiving supplies by sea that was sent from Egypt at great cost, which shows the importance of the place, because they couldn't do that with every settlement. It would have been costing way too much. But you had 4 major resupplying every year that was arriving to Ascalon to make sure the stocks were always maintained at the same level. And the final step was when you learned that an army was campaigning in the region, or when you knew that your settlement would be besieged, it was to gather everything you could around the settlement or to destroy what you couldn't gather. This way, the besiegers could not use it against you as well, because it was a sort of run for the besiegers to take the sites before they would run out of supplies and had to either buy more on markets or to pillage different supplies in the surrounding. So that was for the system, and obviously the emergency gathering using a sort of scorched earth policy was very effective. It has been used by the governor of Jerusalem in 1099 when defending against the First Crusade by taking all the food he could around his settlement and especially destroying all the water sources in a radius of 6 miles around the settlement. In this way, he would limit the ability of the besiegers to access water, which obviously was crucial in that region in which you would need a lot of water. I'm going to speak a bit more about that soon. And destroying the reserves as well was a quite effective method. For instance, during the siege of Antioch in 1097, 1098, by the Crusaders in the First Crusade, they struggled with food for a long time. Not that they were not finding food, but they struggled to have enough carts to move the foods from other regions in the region. And that showed the importance of destroying food just in the surroundings, because then you have to make it come from further away. And if you don't have carts, you can't do it. Or if you don't have enough, you're going to struggle. And you can always attack these carts if you're the besieged as well, to try to make it more difficult. So let's come into the water question during the siege of Jerusalem, because I think it's a very interesting case. There have been estimates made that the average temperature during the siege of Jerusalem, which is obviously very high, and that means that an average man would require about 6 liters of water per day, a horse about 50. So if you look about the Crusader besieging the place, you might have a need of approximately 200,000 liters per day of water. And the governor of Jerusalem, well, as I said before, destroyed water sources in a radius of 6 miles, but also frequently ambushed the Crusaders that were getting further away to get water. So the obtention of water became a real issue and probably went quite close to make the siege fail at some point for the besiegers. And he prepared water pretty well in Jerusalem before by stocking tens of millions of liters of water using either the different cisterns that were in the place or the aqueducts that were probably still working at that time. To give you an idea on why it's so important, water, I've been looking at dehydration effects. So basically, the more body water you're going to lose, the more effects you're going to have that are negative. If you lose 5% of your body water, you're no longer able to fight properly. You can still fight, but not very well, because you'll have some cramps, some pains, and you will feel dizzy, which is obviously not ideal to fight. If you ignore that and go to lose 10% of your body water, you cannot fight anymore. It's literally impossible. You'll bleed from the nose, you'll have headache, not just the normal headache that you might experience, but severe one that will trouble your vision, you'll hallucinate, and more importantly, your body is starting to try to protect itself and the vital organs. So the blood flow will go away from your hands and your foot, so you can't hold a weapon, for instance, anymore. So impossible to fight. And if you continue to ignore that and you reach about 15% of your body water that left, then you will probably fall into coma and die within hours. So water cannot be ignored. Food can be ignored for a few days. The water cannot, especially in very warm climate. So the other question was about food and how much food was needed during the siege. It's difficult to make estimates because we're not sure of what the army size were. It's very tricky. If we follow the estimate that is probably the most accepted, but keep in mind that it might be completely wrong, of around 20,000 inhabitants in Jerusalem, might have been 10,000, might have been 15, 20 is more on the higher estimate. You would need 800 tons of food for the entire siege, and that's an absolute minimum, meaning that you're using the best calorie effective type of food, such as basically wheat, about 1 kilogram of wheat per person per day, which is the very minimum you can have. If you use fruits or meats, you might need more, and that excludes feeding animals. That's just for the inhabitants. But we know that there were cavalry in the place, so that would raise the quantity of food needed as well. For the besiegers, if we take an estimate of about 40,000 people, which might be a bit high, but might also be acceptable if we count civilians in the army, you would need double that amount of food for the entire duration of the siege. So you can see it's huge amount of food it needs. That seems not to have caused any trouble, though, during the siege of Jerusalem. The water was the problem for the besiegers. All right, so that was just an example of foods and how to handle it. Now let's go into siege engines, because that was what I show you at the start. A lot of siege engines in movies are shown, even more probably in video games. So siege engines were an important part of siege warfare, but probably not as decisive as we can see in movies. The first one that I showed you before were siege towers. So siege tower will have different form. It's just one example of it that I was able to find to show you. The point of it is to build something that is higher than the walls. This way you can either fire on the walls and make it the besieged leave the walls to take it, or you can assault the walls directly by using the siege tower on the little breach that you can see here that would get against the walls. In the siege of Jerusalem that I showed you at the start, you could see, I don't know, 10, maybe more siege towers, which is problematic. Saladin is not recorded, and Muslim besiegers in general are not recorded to have had a lot of siege towers in their siege techniques. They were preferring other techniques. The Franks, however, and has a use of siege towers that was a bit more frequent. But the most recorded number of siege towers in a single siege, I think, was 3 siege towers, and not at the same time. So having 10, like here, is completely unrealistic. You would have 1, maybe 2 at the same time. For instance, at Jerusalem in 1099, so by the Crusaders, about a century before, 2 siege towers were used at the same time to take the settlement. So that would be completely unrealistic to see as many, but siege towers did exist. So it's more the quantity that is unrealistic in the movie Kingdom of Heaven than the use of them. However, I must say it was rather rare to use them because you would need wood, and wood was rather scarce in the region, but also it would cost a lot of money to build it. And in many cases, they would simply use ladders that costed less money, or use other techniques that I'll get through as well. Another very famous siege engine is the battering ram that you will see in absolutely every child's book. When you look at Middle Ages, you'll see in literally every siege movie. You'll see that in Kingdom of Heaven. If you've watched Robin Hood's, the Russell Crowe version, you'll find a battering ram as well being used. They did exist, for sure. They did exist, and they were used quite a lot in the 10th century and the 11th century. When we go in my period in the 12th century, and especially when we go later in the 13th century, these were rarely used. You can count the number of cases on your hand for the 12th century. In the Levant, they might have been more frequent in Europe. But the reason why battering rams were not used that much in the region I've looked at is because of how the castles were designed. It might be the most extreme example of an entrance gate that exists with the citadel of Aleppo. But if you were to use a battering ram, you would have basically that ramp to access, which would already be impossible for a ram because it was staircase and not something that was flat. So that would be very difficult to access it. You would need to actually put dirt to level that ramp. You'll have a first gate that is not on the plan, but you would have to destroy this one. And then you'd arrive into the main gatehouse. And the problem is you might destroy the first door, but then you have to turn for the next one, and a ram is not able to turn. So you'd have destroyed the first one, well done, but then you'd arrive in the second and have a ram blocked and blocking your progress. So the ram would be completely ineffective in that regard. And obviously, most sites had a bent entrance like this in the Middle East in the late 12th century, and especially in the 13th century. Obviously, in the example of Aleppo, it's even worse because you'd have a gate here, you'd probably have another one there, probably another one here and here. So you'd have to turn so many times that even if you might turn once, it's impossible to do it more. And in the rooms in between, you'd have availability for the besiegers to attack you from the roof and potentially destroy or lit your ram on fire as well. So rams were not used against gates in the period. Sometime against walls, we have a few examples, especially when walls were very thin. But it seems to be more European examples as well than Middle Eastern ones, in which citadels were probably a bit bigger than that. There is a question about some cities that had dodgy fortifications, whether that could be used, but it's not recorded by source. So it's really difficult to know whether it happened or not against these places. But battering rams, they did exist, but in the period I'm looking at, it's better to think they were not used or so rarely that you would not rely on a battering ram. Then that's to give you the Aleppo citadel, how it looks. So basically that main gate house is this, and you already have a first gate here and a whole long sort of bridge to get through. So that's just to show you what it looked like in reality. Obviously, if it has been a bit destroyed since, but yeah. Then you have siege artillery, as it was shown in both of the movies I've introduced at the start as well. That's a trebuchet, which is probably the most famous form of siege artillery in the Middle Age. It was frequent in the period to use them just the same than catapults or other siege artillery that existed. Obviously, you have so many different types of siege artillery that exist with so many different names. The point is more to speak about them as a whole. They were used indeed, but not in the way you see that in movies. Clearly, what you will see in movies, that's Kingdom of Heaven again. They use trebuchets to actually destroy the wall, breach it, and then assault the place. Mike Fulton has published a book about siege artillery during the Crusades, and has shown that most of the artillery would not have been able to destroy walls, or if doing so, that would have taken a very long time. And instead, what was targeted was not the wall instead, was the merlons on the top. Because if you were destroying these that were way thinner than the walls, then the besieged on the walls would not have something to hide behind. So they would not be able to continue to fire arrows at you without taking damage themselves. So it was a very good way to force the besieged to abandon the section of the wall before attacking the walls with ladders, but not to destroy them. Another use of artillery is more psychological. Instead of targeting the walls, it's to target the houses behind and to destroy civilians' houses or other buildings. So using a psychological weapon and you're not forced, obviously, to send only stones. You can send other things. We have a few rare records, not in the Crusades, but in other regions, of sending animal corpses to try to put sickness in a place, but it's very rare examples. So what was used to actually attack the walls? Well, ladders. That was quite frequent, but in the region, and especially by Muslim besiegers, it was to undermine walls. So this action, so this picture is not amazing, but I've not found better. Forget that bit, not really realistic. But look at the tunnel. So you would dig a tunnel under the walls. When you would reach the wall, you would actually put that on fire, and all the pillars that you've put with wood would collapse. And basically the dirt would collapse, making the walls collapse as well. So you would create a small breach in the walls that would allow you to assault through. Obviously, it's a very difficult thing to do because you need to dig a tunnel to know exactly where you are before you make it fall, because if you do it 1 meter too far, it's not working. 1 meter too soon, it's not working either. So it requires a high level of technicity to know where you are, and it's a technique that have been used forever in siege warfare, in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, and that you still can find in very modern battlefields. For instance, during the American Civil War in Petersburg, they're actually digging under the enemy lines to try to blow them up. And it's failing quite a few times before working. So that is ideal, but obviously the medieval commanders were not completely incompetent and adapted to that. So a way to adapt to undermining was to use ancient columns in your design. So that, for instance, is an ancient column that have been put to strengthen a wall. It might seem very weird taken like this, but the tunnel that you'll dig will very likely be quite thin. If you put an ancient columns, maybe your tunnel will be like 1 meter wide, something like this. So if the dirt is actually falling, the column will hold the rest of the wall. So it will not collapse. So your tunnel will need to be way wider to make the column actually fall, because otherwise it will hold. So that's a very ingenious way to reuse ancient columns that were about everywhere in the region, and to use them in specific space of your castle or of your walls, especially in towers, to avoid them to be mined. Obviously, there would be a lot of other techniques that I could get through with you today. How you assault a settlement, how you attack it, how you would sally out as a besieged to try to destroy siege engines, to attack the supplies I've shown, for instance, with Jerusalem, or to simply fight a battle against your enemy and try to defeat its army. But there is not enough time to do that, obviously. The only thing I'm going to conclude on is, as you can see, siege warfare is quite different than the image you can have in pop culture, but as well, there is an entire section of siege warfare that tend to be ignored by most video games or by most movies, is the action of surrendering. In fact, you have probably as many assaults as surrender. And the reason is, at one point when you fought a certain time, surrendering is not a bad option, because it allows you to protect the lives of the people inside, sometimes even the goods inside the place. And for many local elites, having a Muslim ruler was not that much different than a Frankish ruler, because both were foreigners. Either a Turkish ruler that was not from the zone, that just arrived 50 years before the Crusades, or a crusader that arrived 50 years later but was still a foreigner. The changing allegiance was frequent, and surrendering was something that was quite easy to set up, because for the besieged, it was a good solution to protect lives, but for the besiegers, it was also a good way to take a site without losing too many lives, but reducing the amount of loot you would get from an assault. So that would not please the troops, but that would obviously be an easier way. Thank you for listening to me, for your attention, and obviously, if you have any question, I'm more than happy to answer.
Yes, thank you, Thomas.
You're welcome.
I worry when we have these talks that we bust so many myths that we're spoiling people's enjoyment, but I don't think anyone could have listened to that and not come away enjoying the period. So thank you very much for delivering it. So we're open to questions. I have a quick one just to start us off, if that's okay. How are people learning siege techniques and or how to protect against sieges? Is this all learnt on the job, or are there siege manuals that people can consult? Anything like that?
So you have a literature of like military strategy, military tactics that exist in for every belligerent. You have obviously some military treaties that has been written, especially in ancient Rome, that are still used by Western Europe. You have some treaties that have been designed in the 8th and 9th century in the Byzantine Empire that the Byzantine Emperor tend to use quite a lot as well. And you have what we call cavalry treaties or furusiya in the Islamic world that is not just about cavalry, it's also about siege engines, siege techniques, how to properly lead an army. They're not like we know they're used. We don't know how influential they were though, because it's difficult to know how widespread they were. The other thing is learning by experience. Obviously, there was not just one generation completely renewed each time. You always had more experienced people in an army and less experienced that would learn from them. It's also about what you've seen, what you've heard of. So I would say a bit about the theory for the elites that you can find in manuals, but most about experience. And also tales that you've heard. Sometimes it's not something you've seen, it's something you've heard as well. And finally, you have specialists of siege warfare, especially of certain techniques to build siege towers, to build siege artillery, but also to undermine. They're very famous. For instance, Aleppo is very famous to have had very competent miners for sieges. And they had a fame in the whole Islamic world of being quite good at that. They were not leaders, they were specialized groups for that.
Lovely. I've got questions flooding in online. Any questions from in the room before I crack on with this? Perfect. So, yes, Alan, I think it is.
I'm interested in your statistics. So you identified 251 locations.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the frequency with which these locations figured. So what would be your top 10 or maybe your top 5 that were besieged most frequently?
So for the benefit of the audience, that if you just in case you didn't hear it, that's top 5 locations besieged most frequently.
So usually most sites would be besieged like maybe twice or 3 times in the century I've looked at. You have a few places that reach over 10 sieges in the period. So it's about a siege every 10 years. Amongst these, you have Mosul, you have Edessa. If I remember, Edessa, it's 14 times in the period. You have Homs, Hama in Syria. That's clearly the top 4. And then not far behind it, you might have Aleppo, that has been besieged quite a few times. If we do top 5, it's probably, I'm not sure Aleppo would be the 5th, there might be other sites, but the top 4, clearly Edessa, Mosul, Homs, and Hama, which are quite conveniently placed because Mosul is attacked a lot between basically Baghdad and the other leaders that try to fight for the influence around Baghdad and Mosul. Edessa is controlled by the Franks and is getting attacked by Mosul a lot in the period, sometime early at the start of the period. And then for Homs and Hama, they're basically located between Aleppo and Damascus, which are 2 different principalities, and it worked kind of the frontier between the 2 states. So which explains why they're besieged a lot of times. So learning by experience for these sites definitely happened because the population had been experiencing at least 2 or maybe 3 sieges in their lifetime. So the first time might be a surprise for them, but the other ones, they kind of know what to expect as well.
So a question from Mr. Dr. Funk on YouTube, who's curious, although it doesn't meet your definition of a siege, how many instances are there of besiegers turning up and leaving within a day, and they're not entirely sure why they would do that.
So you have a lot of cases in which the site is taken in a day. They arrive, they assault the place, it works. Those in which they would arrive in front of the settlement, they stay a day, they think that the threat of the army would be enough for the place to surrender. They see it's not. They see they're quite willingly to fight, to actually defend themselves. And they just think, well, that site, it's not crucial to us at the moment. So let's just move to another and see if they're just as well prepared. Because they have the army for a limited amount of time. So they have to use it the best way they can in that small amount of time. And sometimes it's just better to take maybe 2 settlements that are worth a bit less, but take them, than to spend all your campaign in front of one and not being sure to take it. It's also a way to secure loyalties in your armies, because if you take 2 different sites, you might give them to 2 of your lieutenants and secure the loyalty, instead of making them lose troops in front of a settlement and having no reward in the end. So it's one day, quite rare. 3-4 days tends to be quite frequent, and then 8-9 days tends to be very frequent. That's the kind of duration in the 1 to 10 days duration I was explaining.
Okay. And on this topic of time, so a question from Chris Smith on Zoom: was there an accepted time to satisfy honour before surrender and potentially avoid sanctions? Because obviously in the gunpowder period, it's when your walls fall, but if you can't guarantee the walls falling.
Yeah. It's a difficult one, because not all authors are writing in the same period. Some are writing in the late 12th century, so they're quite close to the time, but usually they don't give a lot of information about that. Then you have authors in the 13th and in the 14th century. How much their own perception of what's honorable represent what was honorable at that time is a question. You have a few cases in which they accuse the governor to have surrendered too fast, but it's quite rare. I would say as long as the population is protected in the surrender treaty, there tend not to be too much criticism taken. If the population is not protected, it's just a surrender treaty for the governor, his family, maybe his troops, you can see a bit more criticism. And in fact, the only clear example of criticism that I've seen from the period is when a woman decided to surrender the site, which seems to be an obvious critic of the woman being in power more than the surrender speed, because the siege wasn't that fast. It still lasted about 3 weeks, which is quite a decent duration compared to the rest. I think it's more an attack to a woman being in charge than from the speed at which the surrender happened. It's a difficult question. I would say there is no duration. There is one criticism that comes more often, though. It's about the amount of food. If the amount of food stocked was not lasting a month and a half, I've started to see criticism from sources. So it seems to be more that gets some criticism, but not a lot of criticism for the speed of surrender.
Interesting. I have a cluster of questions about weapons, and if that's okay, we'll take them fairly quickly in quick succession. Question from Daniel Van Fossen on Zoom: what's the difference between petries and mangonels? Are you aware of one?
So the main thing is, in historical sources, the vocabulary of source they use, you never really know what they're pointing at. Usually they use ballista, which is a very convenient way to just regroup every type of siege artillery. So the difference is, how much are they differences that we made up afterwards by looking at different things and trying to apply names? How much is it differences that really can be made? It's really difficult to answer, because the vocabulary in sources tend to be very generic, because the people writing them are not soldiers, they're monks in the West. They tend to be religious doctors in Islam. They're not actually having the vocabulary of war. So sometimes they use a word like ballista in Latin that can fit a trebuchet, can fill a catapult. Maybe it can also be used for a scorpion, which is completely different type of weapon as well, which is more like a sort of giant crossbow than an actual catapult. And it would still sometimes be named ballista. An Islamic word, it's also difficult because the meaning of a word can change from another to another. Sometimes they can use a different word as a synonym as well, because maybe just because they didn't want to reuse the same word, or maybe because they were not sure of what it was, because it's an event that happened maybe 500 kilometers away from where they are. So they're not exactly sure. So difficult to actually give a difference. Usually the difference between the siege engine tends to be in the way their mechanism work, either being thrown by traction or by a mechanism. So would that actually be some men that actually pull on it? Would it be a mechanism that you would actually activate and that would throw the thing? It tends to be the difference between the different siege artillery.
Great. And that possibly answers Davina Duckworth's question about ballista. Davina, if you're not entirely sure, give me a bit more detail and I'll check it, Thomas. One more question on weaponry. Was much use made of Greek fire, either in these crusades or in the Levant? Was it the same as similar to naphtha? Although again, this may fall under the vocabulary.
Yeah, so Greek fire is what we named a sort of mixture of petroleum and other product that was used to burn, especially ships under the Byzantine Empire, that was also used in siege warfare. In the Islamic world, that was named naphtha. And it tends to be used to burn things that it's very sort of viscous material. It holds to surface better than if you were throwing just a torch or something like that. It's used a lot by Islamic armies, especially in defense when they're besieged. But it's a very tricky weapon to use because if you throw it wrong, then you can burn your own wall. It happened a few times in which they threw it, then the wind changed and put the fire back against the wall and threatened the wall to collapse because of that. So it can be a tricky weapon to use. Usually you'd have some thrown from the walls, but it's dangerous. Or probably more frequent, people selling out the place with sort of hand grenades of naphtha and throwing them to a siege engine that the besiegers might have to burn it. But to do that, you need to be very close to the siege engine. So you need to go fast. Two technique, either you're very discreet, you do that at night, and try to burn the thing with that, well, before you're spotted, especially if the guard has not been done properly. Or you use a horse and you throw it from the horse. But it's very dangerous because obviously if you have a bit too much vibration, the grenades might actually explode before you throw it and you burn yourself. And you have a few quite funny examples of people burning certain parts of their body, especially genitals, by missing fire. So yeah, it's used. It's quite frequent in defense, but also they have a limited amount of it because it's difficult to do. We have potentially a few recipe in historical sources, but people that try to recreate it never achieve to recreate it. So are these recipe actually working, or are we just not managing to understand the recipe? Very likely.
Yeah. Lovely. That question of raiding siege engines brings us on to another question from a line, and I'll just check if there's any more questions in the room, if that's okay. Because the game asks on YouTube asks, how much freedom of movement did the besieged have? You mentioned raiding the besiegers. How would they achieve that?
So usually when we imagine a siege, we think about a small castle, like a European castle, in which a rather small army would be able to completely blockade it. We have to think that castles in the Levant are usually a bit bigger as well. So blockading it completely would be a bit more difficult. But if we look at cities, towns, then it's so big that armies were usually not able to control every gate of that settlement. So you would usually have 1, 2, maybe 3 gates that would be absolutely free during sieges, and by which the besieged could completely go out and either directly attack them or go further, turn behind the enemy from a few miles and then go on the rear. The other solution is to use postern, so sort of small hidden gates in a wall. That's more 13th century in what I've seen than 12th century. The design of postern tend to be quite rare in the early 12th century. It tends to multiply in the late 12th century. And the principle of a postern is it's a very small door, so you can only send a few men through it, but also mean that if you're discovered, it's easier to stop the enemy than on a large gate, because you need less troops to actually block it, close it, and make it safe again. So if you look to engage in a battle, you'd use one of the main gates, because you couldn't do that from a postern. It would be way too slow to send all your men. If you want to surprise the enemy at night, and that's one of the way you escape enemies' vigilance, is to go at night or at the end of the night, either or at the start of the night, sunset, or at dawn, in which the enemy can be quite tired. Those doing the watch are usually quite tired at dawn, and you try to actually do this, surprise the enemy. But surprise is the main element. They're not able to watch everything, and it's about creating that surprise. So there is also a question for the besiegers: where do I set up my camp? The closer I am to the besieged sites, the more likely they're going to be able to sally in the middle of the night, attack me, destroy my siege engine. But the further I go, the least I can use siege artillery against them, the least blockade pressure I'm putting on them. So it's a question about how close you want to be, and sometimes it was difficult choice. There is a siege by Mosul, of Mosul by Saladin, in which there is a debate between the commanders whether they should actually go closer to the walls or further. Under pressure, he decided to go rather close to the walls. The besieged are able to sally out, destroy the siege engines, also attack them a few times. The morale is getting lower in the besiegers' army because they're not protected. And so he decided to move the camp far away. He's no longer able to use trebuchets or siege artillery like that. And in the end, the siege failed because it was too far. So the besieged were just able to do whatever they wanted. So, yeah.
Great. I've got one last question well, I've got very many questions online. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all, but I've got one I'd pick out. Are there any more questions in the audience? Yes.
Surrendering seems to involve a great element of trust that the besiegers aren't going to massacre everybody inside. I mean, were there kind of like levels of agreement about how you behave?
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question for me?
Yes. So I guess, are there rules of trust and rules of warfare effectively around surrendering? That might be the best way.
So yeah, trust is an important element. Some leaders were having a harder time to obtain surrenders because they were not trusted. One example is Zanki, Muslim leader that reigned from 1128 to 1146, that reign over Mosul and Aleppo. And he betrayed his word in Baalbek in, I think, 1139. And he said to the governor of the citadel, you can surrender with your men, you'll have safe life granted, which we call an aman in Arabic. And he decided not to respect it, to actually kill the governor and the men of the garrison, instead torturing them in the same process. And after that, he really struggled for a few years to obtain surrenders because he was not trusted anymore. So there is a matter of trust. There is a lot of norms of war that can be the tacit norms. That is more the practice of war that has been like that for a long time. There is also some laws of war. How much are they applied or not is a big question, because, for instance, you have law of war in the Christendom that are based on the Bible. How much are they actually enforced in war is a question sometimes. Between Christians, probably quite a lot, but then when you're no longer between Christians, do they still apply or not? How much they apply, how much are they modified? It's difficult. But usually, they had an interest to respect their words as besiegers, because the interest of having a land is to have his economic power. And his economic power is based on the production. So if you kill everyone, if you pillage everyone, you might struggle to hold the site, first of all. You will not produce much resources as well, and further settlements will be less likely to surrender. So you have all the reasons to respect your agreements. There are a few cases of non-respected agreements, but they're rare. You have Zanki, as I said. The Crusaders at the start of the period have had a few episodes in which It's unsure whether part of the army disagreed on the agreements and decided to ignore it, or whether just the army decided to not respect the agreements. Marat's on Numan is one of them during the First Crusade, in which inhabitants are supposedly given a protection in one of the palaces of the settlement, but then the next day they decided to slaughter them. You have the same case in Jerusalem a bit later, people that are given by one of the commanders and a man, but then the next day they get massacred. What I'd say is usually norms were respected. Very few cases in which it wasn't respected. And these cases are at the start of the Frankish period by the Franks, like from 1097 to around 1110, in which you have a lot of norms of war that are transgressed, especially in massacre. For instance, killing women and children instead of enslaving them tends to be a bit more practiced by the Franks at that time. And a few individual leaders like Zanki that has a pretty bad reputation in that regard. How much the reputation is justified in Baalbek, but there is not really another example of Zanki betraying his word. On the other hand, Saladin has a great image in the West as well as in Islamic lands for being a chivalrous person. But when his first action as a leader is to slaughter the Fatimid Guard, despite giving them an man and slaughtering their families, when he said, "Gather there, you're going to be protected, and I'm going to let you go." So reputation is also something that is interesting to look at because it's not always deserved. But yeah.
Lovely. I will ask one more question just so we don't have to end on betrayal, torture, and slaughter, etc.
Fair enough.
What is your favorite depiction in popular culture of a medieval siege? Doesn't have to be the best one, but your favorite one.
I'll say two of them.
Okay.
I'll cheat a bit on that. One is a movie that is absolutely dreadful, which is Ironclad, which has an amazing depiction of undermining. It's probably the best depiction of undermining I've seen in a movie. The rest is complete garbage, but that is a very interesting one. Very bloody movie. You might not want to watch in itself, but that scene of undermining is really good. I really like Kingdom of Heaven, Siege of Jerusalem, despite all I've said about there is way too many siege engines, there is way too many troops. However, the depiction of the diplomatic talk between Balian and Saladin, as much as they might not be true, they're taken from historical narratives. And that's something I found quite interesting, to have that talk that supposedly happened between the two recorded in sources being used in. So I would say probably these two for the Middle Ages. We're not very lucky with sieges in movies, but Middle Ages, I'd say overall. But Ironclad would be my soft spot for a movie that is absolutely awful otherwise.
There we go. So we've got yes, popular culture stuff that if people are curious, they can have a look at. Do you have any publications coming out that you'd like to recommend to people if they're interested in finding out more about this topic?
I've published an article that is open access, so it's free to look at it, about Carboha's campaign against the First Crusade and trying to explain his failure by other reasons that have been made before, especially looking at the structure of the Islamic army that in my mind was deficient, looking at the lack of loot that has consequences in the army and leading to desertions. So it has been published in a journal which is named Al-Masak, and it's available online for free. So yeah,
fantastic. Yes, but unfortunately that brings us to the end of today's content. I would, however, before we go, like to thank Thomas for today's talk. I'd like to also thank Laurie from I'd like to thank Josh, who is behind the scenes working on the YouTube stuff. Most of all, thank you to the audience, both live and virtual, for your questions, comments, engagement. We would very much like to know how you thought about this. There is the feedback. There's also in the end slides. If you could do that, that would be much appreciated. Our next talk will be in 2 weeks' time, and it will take us to Europe at the turn of the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars saw an unprecedented number of men separated their families and sent overseas to fight. Séverine Anger of the University of York will take us through some of their correspondence and the light it sheds on their wartime experiences. For details of this talk and all the other ones in our series, go to our website, which is royalarmouries.org, or Eventbrite, or any other social media site of your choice, and you will find out about them. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in 2 weeks' time.
And if I must say, Severin is an absolutely great speaker as well.
Lovely. What more of an advertisement can you get?
Thank you. Well, thank you for organizing it, and thank you for everyone that came as well. That was really nice to see a few people in person as well.